Over the weekend, there was a peace summit in Switzerland that included somewhere around 70 heads of state, senior delegations, primarily from the West, whose ostensible purpose was to bring peace and end the war between Russia and Ukraine. But as we talked about over the weekend with Colonel Jacques Beau, both before the thing happened and then again once that it had started, it was really pretty much dead on arrival. It had no rational basis for going on. And we now have somebody, now that the summit has been over and we've seen some of the fallout from it, some of the reactions from it, that has kind of been reinforced in a little bit stronger way. And the question is going to be, what now? What is going to be the fallout from this? Is there going to be any ramifications? Is there going to be any change policies? And there's nobody better to talk about that than former British diplomat Ian Proud. We've had on the show before. Ian, thanks for coming on today and welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. It's really nice to see you again. Thanks for inviting me.
Really good to see you again, too. And I think the last time we saw each other was actually in person in London there at a dinner with several of our colleagues. An absolutely delightful evening. Sorry, but I reminisce at the wrong time here. Let's get into this here. So one of the first things that really jumped out to me was the fact that before the thing started was you had China said they're not going to come. You had several others. I think it was Brazil that said they're going to come in an observer status only. So they were just kind of there in name only. And then you had President Biden choose not to come. And instead, he wanted to have Kamala Harris go. So the guy who's supposed to be their biggest challenger said he would rather go to a fundraiser in Washington, something that's obviously not that important to international affairs. But just those signals alone was really big, I think, shot across the bow that this isn't going anywhere, not the least of which because Russia wasn't even invited to a negotiation to find a peace settlement that they're part of the party to. But then the next biggest thing that jumped out at me was after it was over and it was come time for the communique, you had India actually decide not to sign it and said this.
Our participation in this summit and continued engagement with all stakeholders is with a view to understanding different perspectives, approaches, and options to find a way forward for a sustainable resolution of the conflict. In our view, only those options acceptable to both parties can lead to abiding peace. In line with this approach, we have decided to avoid association with the joint communique or any other document emerging from this summit.
What, as a diplomat, how meaningful do you find the Indian representatives' comments publicly after not signing?
So whenever you go to any summit, I organise a G8 summit in the UK that Obama came to back in 2013. You know, when you're signing on the dotted line, however kind of bland to the ordinary observer these communiques may be, they mean something to the countries that sign up to them. They're that country saying, well, I basically agree with everything that's said on this bit of paper. Now, if you're talking about some generic kind of global policy issue around sort of climate change or whatever it may be, so women's health and education, vaccines and that sort of stuff, it's kind of easier to kind of get away with the compromise text that you're not very happy with. But you know, when it comes to the issue of the very toxic kind of Ukraine-Russia relationship in the context of the war, then actually Zelensky's effectively asking India to kind of agree to his version of the way forward on peace. And actually what India is saying and what other kind of countries, the BRICS countries in particular, so 9 of the G20 countries, that actually they want a peace process that actively involves both parties. If they're going to sign their name to a peace process, then you know, they want that process to involve both sides. And you know, as we've all seen, the Swiss event was choreographed and organized explicitly to exclude Russia, you know, a key party to the war.
But let me ask you this, from a diplomatic perspective on these kinds of things, whether it was this one or nearly any of the others, as you just mentioned there, it's my understanding that typically the people who are invited to it are going to have 75% understanding of what's going to be the outcome anyway. And so they're certainly going to know what they're going to be expected to sign on before they come. Yeah. So was either that not done, or did something materially change that would cause India to say, we're going to send a representative and then publicly say we're not going to sign it? That seems a little unusual to me.
No, nothing changed. I mean, the problem was that there are two very different visions of how the event would unfold. There's the Swiss vision, and the Swiss vision kind of said explicitly on the kind of Swiss government website, you know, a peace process must involve Russia. A peace process without Russia is unthinkable. And from the Ukrainian perspective, this was an opportunity to kind of push Zelensky's so-called peace formula, you know, 3 points of which are completely unachievable: withdrawal of troops, territorial integrity, and issues around kind of global human rights tribunal. So there's already a conflict going in between, you know, what the Swiss wanted to use the summit for and what Zelensky himself wanted to use it for. And you know, the Indians went along as did other countries, but when they saw actually that even the very watered down you know, communique at the end, it's still very much kind of exclusionary in terms of, you know, putting all the blame on Russia in its very kind of limited and bland way, only focusing on 3 of the topics. And they said, well, actually, this isn't really the kind of Swiss version that we signed up for.
And so what do you think? And if you have any inside information from what some other diplomats have said, that would be really great to hear. But otherwise, just what does your experience tell you when this was announced? I mean, it was self-evident by the fact that it was exclusively going to or intentionally going to exclude Russia. So we knew before the thing even started that there was going to be any kind of negotiations or even come to any kind of agreement on the general outlines of a negotiation, like what happened in Istanbul in 2022. So what was the expectation? What was the hoped for outcome for the other countries that participated? I think it's clear what Zelensky wanted. I think it is anyway, that he just wanted people to endorse his vision of things. But what was the value of all these other countries to come when they knew Russia wasn't going to be there?
Well, bear in mind that of the kind of 78 countries that signed, you know, 55 of those actually were, you know, from the European and the Western Alliance. There's only a very small number of non-Western Alliance kind of countries that attended and signed, like 27 in total. And leading up to the summit itself, Zelensky was on this kind of global tour trying to encourage people to come along. The Saudis only came at the last minute because Zelensky went to Riyadh just a few days before summit and saw Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. You know, he also engaged with the Argentinian president. You know, the key is to get them on board. There's this huge effort to kind of get like non-sort of Western, if you like, sort of focused countries to go, and even then they only secured 27. So I think actually some people came along because they were under pressure to do so, but when it came down to actually, you know, signing on the dotted line, they said, well, you know, we're happy to join the discussion, but actually, you know, we want a much more broad-based approach to peace.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times the watered-down communique, and I've heard that term used quite a bit on media. What about this communique? Well, what does it actually say, and what is it about it that you think is watered down?
So diplomatic communiques tend to get watered down anyway, just, you know, particularly the more countries you're involved, the more they get watered down. But actually, Zelensky's peace formula has like 10 points in it. I won't elaborate them all here. This only really kind of focused on 3 of those points: on nuclear security around the Zaporizhia plant, on food security, no access to the port so that kind of grain supplies could be shipped out to other countries, and on repatriation of kind of prisoners, and the issue around kind of civilians that Ukraine claims have been abducted and taken to Russia. But you know, the wording on all of those, you know, was very kind of very carefully kind of caveated. For example, sort of access to kind of Azov and Black Sea ports, you know, didn't actually say by whom. It just said allowing free access. For example, you know, the wording around the nuclear safety was kind of very caveated, although you could see the kind of the footprint of Ukraine on that wording there. The whole thing kind of read very, very kind of bland indeed. But actually, you know, there were some kind of key trigger points that I think for the Indians and others would have said, well, actually, even so, this is still too much for us. For example, the quite harsh wording on repatriations of kind of civilians and abducted children, for example, and the fact that, you know, right at the end of the communique, while it talks about the involvement of all parties in the future process, it still doesn't actually mention Russia. So I think despite the fact that only focused on 3 of the 10 points in Zelensky's plan, it didn't focus on the most contentious issues and had very watered down language. Even what they had some trigger points where kind of G20, so BRICS, global South countries felt they couldn't sign up to that.
I see. It appears to me that one of the maybe I can even go so far as to say fatal flaws of this so-called peace summit heading in, aside from the most glaring one that it didn't include Russia, so that really meant that there was no possibility of having any kind of a settlement anyway. But the second part is it's frankly unclear what America's actual objectives are. I'm going to show you a couple of clips here in back-to-back here that really illustrate what the big gulf is from some of the most senior members of the Biden administration, what they're saying about what America's objectives in this whole process are. And then I'd just like your view on the backside of what you think it was, even before that. And then we'll see where we go from there. So first of all, this is Jake Sullivan, and he's talking about this is just a couple of days ago, maybe even yesterday, in light of the Swiss peace conference, what it's intended to do.
President Zelensky has made clear, including here in Switzerland, that ultimately this war will have to be determined at the negotiating table. The United States' goal has been to put Ukraine in as strong as possible a position on the battlefield, so it is in as strong a position as possible at the negotiating table. It's up to Ukraine to decide when and how that occurs. Its strength at the negotiating table will be improved by what's happened here in Switzerland, because you have more than 100 countries and international organizations coming together to lay a foundation for a just peace built on a simple proposition. You cannot take territory by force. It says that in the United Nations Charter. It's at the core of international law. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity has to be respected.
Okay, well, just on the first point there, anytime you say they're trying to find a just peace, that very much depends upon whose perspective you're saying just is. And as you put, we're going to show some of this in a minute. You just published something that kind of breaks down some of the key points, which we'll bring up in a minute. We'll look at that in more detail. But one of the things you say in there is that the way that Russia looks at this is not the same way that the Ukraine side looks at this.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, there's almost a battle for kind of ownership of like the UN Charter. Clearly kind of Ukraine and Jake Sullivan are pushing on this idea that, Russia has kind of catastrophically breached Article 2 of the UN Charter by sort of interfering with kind of Ukraine's territorial integrity. But actually, no doubt that is kind of a strongly held view. But on the Russian side, that they feel that Article 2 of the UN Charter has been breached by the gradual encroachment of NATO, including into Europe, such that they felt that their sort of political identity was being threatened by an outside military force. So but both sides can argue like the UN Charter game, but actually one of the kind of things Jake Sullivan's trying to do there is to say that actually in the Ukraine and the US are on the right side of the UN, but actually that point is very, very debatable.
Right. Okay. So, and that's debatable. What's also debatable is America's objective in here. What Jake Sullivan specifically said was it is U.S. policy that Ukraine be helped on the battlefield so that it can be in a better negotiating position to get a negotiated end, which nearly all wars do. That's what he said, and that was yesterday on the 16th of June. On the 7th or the 6th of June, just 10 days earlier, you had John Kirby explaining a very different objective for America.
We have to stand up to aggressors. You can't let them just change borders by force. And we have done that. And it's not just the United States. 50 some other nations have helped Ukraine try to beat back this aggression. And you're right about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. That is Ukrainian soil. And they have every right to claim that soil back. It's their country. And we want to make sure they have the tools to do that and the skills to do that. And we're going to continue to provide that kind of support.
So then President Biden agrees with the 1991 Ukraine territory.
Of course.
Of course. So we want to help them to get a negotiated settlement, or we want to help them get back to the 1991 borders.
Right, exactly. No, exactly. And actually, one of the things I also picked up from Jake Sullivan's comments was this idea that Zelensky's always made it clear that he sees an end to this negotiating table. He absolutely hasn't. He's actually made it illegal. He's made it illegal to talk to Putin, as the president of Ukraine. So he clearly doesn't, see the future in a negotiated settlement directly with Putin himself.
So let me ask you this from a diplomatic perspective, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's from the G7, the G20, Western nations. How do people view this seeming contradiction in senior official statements of what America's policy and objectives actually are?
Well, I mean, that's why kind of BRICS countries, G20 countries, i.e. non-Western G20 countries and global South countries have been turned off by this event, because they don't actually see it as something that's genuinely advancing the cause of peace in Ukraine. They don't see it as something that's seeking a solution where, you know, both parties to the conflict, being Ukraine and Russia, are sitting around the table together and talking about these really difficult and intractable kind of challenges that they face in fixing over the very, very long term their relationship. You know, there's absolutely no trust that this is a genuine process, and that's why, you know, these countries are unwilling to sign up to it. And I think that, you know, that is not going to change. You know, what happened in Switzerland over the weekend was a look at the kind of three easiest topics, you know, on Zelensky's agenda, and even that, you know, the global South was unable to kind of sign up to. So this rift has emerged, if you like, between you know, the kind of, I think Jake Sullivan basically thinks exactly the same as Kirby, just uses kind of much more kind of fluffy words, you know, around it. Quite frankly, the kind of US and the kind of the European, or at least the kind of, you know, the European Commission, that's a UK kind of view on actually, you know, changing the war aim so that kind of Ukraine can achieve the impossible on the battlefield, and the people in the global South that say, well, actually, this will only be ended through a genuine process of negotiation that involves both sides, and that rift is only going to grow. And Zelensky's, if Zelensky really believes he can have these big events, you know, that involve, you know, the global South, he's going to have to make compromise, because they're not going to settle with the US-led view on the way forward.
Well, now here's a problem, or an additional complication. You mentioned, you know, there's got to be both sides at the table. Well, there were dueling peace proposals that were really started last week, Friday, when Vladimir Putin, ahead of this Swiss summit, came out with a declaration of what he was actually willing to do, that he had a peace proposal and a genuine end to the negotiation according to his terms. And we're going to see that in just a second. But here is the way that Jake Sullivan said that the Western side views that, and I'm sure Zelensky is on this. Here's what he said.
What is most interesting in watching these last 2 days is the split screen of this weekend with what we heard from President Putin as he laid out his vision for peace a couple of days ago, where he said, not only does Ukraine have to give up the territory Russia currently occupies, but Ukraine has to leave additional sovereign Ukrainian territory before Russia will negotiate. And Ukraine must disarm so that it is vulnerable to future Russian aggression down the road. No responsible nation can say that is a reasonable basis for peace. It defies the UN Charter, it defies basic morality, it defies basic common sense.
Well, funny thing about basic common sense, about what it does or doesn't define. Before I make a comment about what I think that he's missing here, Jake Sullivan is missing, let's listen to what Vladimir Putin actually did say.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now, back to what Sullivan said, I think that he is right in one sense, is that no nation would want to hear that, because Putin was unequivocal in what he said, the demilitarization, denazification, and basically he wants a neutral entity called Ukraine in between him and NATO. And he's saying that you'll basically have to surrender all four of these oblasts that we, according to the UN Charter, illegally annexed, but he says that they're Russian territory. But the thing is, as I've shown here before, there's lots of those territories still under Ukrainian control. So he's saying for peace, you've got to willingly give those up, and then we can have peace. And of course, nobody wants to do that. So he's right as far as that goes. But here's where I think he's wrong, and I'd like your view on this, in that, yes, ideally, nobody would want to give up territory. But if the military balance is so skewed that given enough time, those territories can be seized and taken by force, and only at the cost of possibly hundreds of thousands of more of your people, suddenly that doesn't become such a non-negotiable deal there. Maybe it is worth taking into. What do you think about that part right there?
So I think in classic Putin style, and I've seen this quite a lot, I mean, what is drawn there is basically Istanbul and a bit more, which is a classic kind of Russian tactic. You know, you take another kind of bite of the cherry, and the bit more, you know, beyond what was discussed and then sort of pushed off the table by the Americans and the Brits, you know, in March 2022, is a kind of the withdrawal from Kherson and Zaporizhia cities, essentially. You know, that they're the added bits. But again, in typical Putin fashion, he's been very ambiguous about what he means by that. He hasn't necessarily said, you know, the occupation of those cities by Russian forces. I find it sort of questionable that Russia would want to commit to a kind of a full-scale urban sort of battle in both places. I mean, Kherson changed hands twice, you know, at the start of the war. You know, it was initially taken by Russia and then it's taken back by Ukraine, you'll recall, but neither party really fought for it. You know, right. Ukraine could defend it at the time, and then Russia was kind of trimming its own front lines and retrench. You know, there's not really been a major urban battle within this conflict, with the exception of Mariupol, which we saw was absolutely devastating. So, you know, it's questionable whether, you know, Putin will want to fight that, but he's kind of put that out there to kind of, you know, why, you know, if you like, to kind of alarm the Western powers to get to provoke what the Russians like to provoke, which is quite a sharp response from the likes of Jake Sullivan. I think the question for me there is actually whether there'd be scope to kind of because buffer zones have been discussed quite a lot in the past few months, as I'm sure you're aware, whether, you know, there may be scope to negotiate some sort of buffer zone with Kherson City and Zaporizhia being some sort of a buffer zone, you know, when a ceasefire is kind of struck, you know, if that makes sense. But the core of actually Putin's proposal is really the Istanbul Agreement. I mean, that's really what it is. You can throw away the denazification, which is kind of standard Russian propaganda, propaganda speak. I mean, what is at its core is going back to the Istanbul Agreement and starting again from that as a basis. I don't really see that kind of Putin wants another Mariupol, or at least two more much bigger kind of Mariupols.
Yeah. So now you spend a lot of time in Moscow at the British embassy there, so you have a really good idea about how the Russians think about things. What do you think Putin's intent was by making this declaration? Because Sullivan's right in that there's, in the current conditions, there's no way that Kiev or Washington or any other Western capital is going to say, you know what, yeah, that sounds good, let's go ahead and end the war that way. So he knows, Putin does, that his proposal isn't going to be accepted. So since it's not going to be accepted or rejected, what then does Putin gain by making those claims?
Well, he's done it on the eve of the Swiss summit, of course. So he's caused a big distraction by doing so, and you know, he's caused that distraction for the kind of global South countries that are going to an event where there's no clearly defined kind of purpose or scope of what's being offered. You know, a very vague kind of communique is drawn out. I mean, people aren't so sold by the Zelensky plan. So Putin's saying, well, here you go. Before you go into that complete sort of fuzzy kind of mess, this is what Russia proposes, you know, even though they weren't actually invited. So it's a distraction technique partly, but it's also restating, if you like, that actually we're happy to kind of go back to the Istanbul format as a basis to start talks if Zelensky, you know, decides to pull on his suit and sit at the table again.
And on that point, what is your understanding of the Russian mentality of negotiations, in that they put these maximalist demands up there, but the expectation that they're going to negotiate some of those things away? So is there genuinely a room to say, all right, let's take what you said, let's take what Zelensky said, and let's actually start having a dialogue and see if we can find, you know, minimize the distance between them? Is that possible?
Yeah, no, I think so. And it certainly was in Istanbul, if you recall, where a lot of progress was made, you know, towards basically what Putin's just proposed, with a few extra bits being Kherson City and Zaporizhia kind of city. So, you know, the Russians will negotiate. They'll always want to negotiate from a position of strength, and they're in a much stronger position now than they were in March 2022, when they just started to suffer some major kind of battlefield sort of degradations. You know, given the Western weapons being deployed in that theatre. So yeah, they're in a stronger position now, but actually the starting point is not dissimilar to what it was, and they will drive hard. But I think long term, actually, Putin does want to see an end to this conflict, but he wants to do it on terms that that he can live with as well, rather than having it forced on him by the West and by a president who he now considers to be past his shelf life, as his elected term in office has expired.
Yeah, right. That's a challenge for both sides to try to figure out here. Now, at this point, it doesn't appear that either side has come. Well, maybe rephrase that. Anytime there's going to be a chance for genuine negotiations, both sides have to come to some point to where they're really close to agreeing that the war can't be won militarily and their objectives can't be gotten. But each side has maximalist objectives. And when they both recognize it's just not going to happen, now then you have a chance for having negotiations. We don't seem to be at that spot yet, as evidenced by what Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said just a couple of days ago about how much stronger the Ukraine side's getting.
The Ukrainians have done a lot to fortify their defensive positions, and they're making good use of the weapons and munitions that they're being provided. And more of that will continue to flow in. And so, in my view, they'll get stronger as time progresses. They're also doing things to mobilize more people and train more people. And so the combination of those things, I think, will have a pretty substantial effect on the battlefield, but it will take some time to kind of play out. But the good news is that we have the means to continue to provide security assistance, and you'll see it continue to flow in a very meaningful way.
Now, if the only public statement from the U.S. side had been the one from Jake Sullivan saying that our objective is to get them strong enough to negotiate from a position of strength to end the war, those might possibly go together. You could say, well, that's Austin just, saying, hey, we're going to keep giving them weapons. So, there's not a military solution for the Russian side. So you have reason to negotiate. But then you also have the John Kirby one saying, no, it's the 1991, and the Ukraine side wants to win and wants to outright militarily defeat Ukraine. And of course, that's being backed up by Zelensky, who seems to favor that one more about 1991, because I've not ever heard him say since before Istanbul. I will say that's one caveat. He's not said anything about any negotiated settlement. He still wants to win. So what then? I'm not clear what the message is, Austin, because he's talking about them getting stronger, and I'm just wondering, from a diplomatic perspective, from your ears there, how does what he says fits into what Kirby said, what Sullivan said, and what is going on the ground?
Well, I think there are two aspects to that. I mean, you always have to kind of talk up your position, right? Particularly in a negotiation, you have to always give the impression that you feel stronger than you necessarily kind of really are. And very clearly, any objective observer can see that Ukraine is, despite the kind of the inflows of Western support, not in the ascendancy on the battlefield against Russia, even though it's a bit of a kind of holding pattern, really with Russia not kind of committing its full troops. So I mean, there's talking about Ukraine's ability long term to kind of strengthen its position. I think the US has to do that. I think there's another element to this, which is kind of maintaining the kind of pretense, if you like, the US strategy has been working in the run up to a presidential election at the end of this year. Because I mean, the worst thing for the Democrat Party is to be seen to have had a policy in Ukraine that has failed. I mean, it kind of it's a stalemate from now till November with this kind of drip feed of propaganda that Ukraine is getting stronger, our support is helping them, and eventually, their position will be strengthened. Is a better message than just outright defeat, frankly, before the election. So I think that sort of pretense kind of has to be maintained. I mean, in terms of the kind of the space, if there really is a space in Sullivan, Kirby, and Austin, I really don't think there is. I think the explicit US position, has always been that actually they want to see a kind of a complete defeat of Russia on the battlefield. Clearly, Zelensky feels the same, even though no country, the US, EU sponsors and others can actually kind of help them to do that. But I think that's very clearly.
And I think that confusion and those mixed messages are having a significant negative effect. So one of the things at this point, and again, if you can bring up that headline there, from Ian's comments here, one of the things that you pointed out right up at the beginning was that you said the West makes up 2/3 of the signatories, and of the 82 signatories to the communique, 45 are European countries, including non-European members, and there were 4 European institutions and 5 other Western allies. Then you went on to say that makes up 55 countries and institutions. So that means there's hardly any outside of that. Now, I saw something earlier today that pointed out that in February 2023, that 141 states supported the UN General Assembly resolution that called for, among other things, the withdrawal of Russian forces. But today, a total of only 78 nations signed on to that watered down communique, as you mentioned. So it seems to me that, quote, our side is bleeding support and it's going down. And do you think that part of the reason for that is because either of the mixed messages that we give or the unrealistic objectives that we're seeking?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, when that first big UNGA resolution, happened not long after the war started, everybody was vitally in a state of shock about what had happened. The first kind of big major war in Ukraine on European soil, well, not really since the Second World War, but really since the Balkans conflicts of the 1990s. That was a huge kind of shock to the system, and I think the UNGA resolution at the time kind of represented that. What we're seeing now is actually kind of people saying, well, actually 2 years down the track, should we not be trying to find a negotiated settlement to this? And countries in the global south and above. But I noticed, for example, Thailand, which was one of the countries, I know Thailand very well, so I served there as well previously in my career. They voted in favour of the kind of resolution in 2022. They didn't associate themselves with it, despite attending the Swiss summit, at the weekend. I think lots of countries are saying, well, come on, actually, there can't only be this kind of US-led military solution only kind of approach to this conflict. There needs to be a proper negotiated settlement, and that's what countries are increasingly kind of turned off by, the lack of genuine intent to achieve that from both the Ukrainian side, but also kind of the Western side.
Yeah, and it's and as you also pointed out, Gary, if you can bring the second one up. One of the things that also jumped out to me is you wrote about the Middle East and that they're almost completely turned its back on the summit here. And that the first thing I've highlighted in blue up there is that Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry said, we believe it is important that the international community encourage any step towards serious negotiations, which will require difficult compromises as part of a roadmap that leads to peace. Now, the way that certainly sounds to my ears is that they're recognizing the same thing we talk about on this channel a lot, and that I think we've mentioned with you, that if there's going to be a negotiated settlement, the realities on the ground being what they are, and especially the disparity in the war-making capacity between the two sides is overwhelming on the Russian side, is that any negotiation will require some territory that was at Ukraine in 1999 that's going to be going to the Russian side, or it's just not a realistic. That's what it sounds like Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is saying.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And of course, the Istanbul Agreement, assumed some longer term process around kind of the territory that Russia had already taken. So, I think countries increasingly kind of don't see a full military kind of solution to this. They want there to be a negotiated settlement, and that, unfortunately, given the battlefield realities today, 20% of its territory, lost. Ukraine may need to make some difficult concessions. What the contours of that look like will have to be ultimately agreed by Ukraine and Russia themselves. But I think Crimea is an obvious one. So yeah, I mean, there will have to be compromise, and I think that's where that you get this real separation with US policy. It's saying, well, no, take back Crimea, take back the Donbass. So you see in broad daylight then the kind of the huge gulf that exists between the global south that say, well, there has to be compromise, and the US that says, and Zelensky that really kind of says, there can be no compromise. And even though Zelensky talks it in the language of I want to make peace, one of the statements he made during the summit about Russia's exclusion was, well, if Russia wanted peace, they wouldn't have made war. So clearly, he still doesn't want to talk to Russia to kind of find a negotiated settlement, and that is unlikely to change. And the longer the war goes on, I mean, the more untenable, democratically untenable his position becomes, of course.
So I want to look at the Middle East. I want to stick there for just a second. What do you make of the fact that the U.S. And the Western world writ large has lots of allies in the Middle East? I mean, lots of them. We're trying to make deals with Saudi Arabia right now for security cooperation, obviously with Kuwait and Qatar, several of these others, UAE, et cetera. What does it say to you that none of them, I think other than Qatar, signed on to this? Because I would have guessed, and tell me if you think that I'm wrong here, that prior to the summit, we would have been doing a lot of diplomatic behind the scenes stuff to try to get our allies to get on board to try to support this. But it looks like none of them did, other than Qatar.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Qatar's actively involved in the negotiations about prisoner handovers, and that's actually been some time. Saudis played a good role there too. But I mean, I think the complete, with the exception of Qatar, sort of Middle East kind of turn away from the Swiss summit was largely kind of framed in the context of what's happening in Israel, Gaza as well, where they see parallels between what's happening in Israel and Gaza and what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, where there's a sense, right or wrong, that US is only really interested in a settlement that actually suits one party of the conflict. In Israel and Gaza, that's Israel. In Russia and Ukraine, that's kind of Ukraine. And actually, they say, well, look at what's happening in Israel, Gaza. Actually, you're trying to do the same thing in Russia, Ukraine. And actually, we believe that a solution has to kind of ultimately kind of meet the requirements of both parties, however difficult the choices that both parties have to make in that process of negotiation.
And do you have any knowledge, or do you have any sense of whether the U.S. was trying to convince some of these Middle Eastern allies to go to the Swiss summit, and what what the U.S. negotiators were told as to why none of them agreed to do it, or was it what you just said there, or do you even know?
Yeah, no, they would have been full bore. The British would have been too. I mean, the ambassadors in country would have been kind of lobbying hard for attendance. Obviously, Zelensky visited Saudi Arabia himself just a few days before the summit, and that actually saved a last-minute Saudi attendance, even though the Saudis didn't actually sign the agreement itself. There would have been very active lobbying, but I mean, that lobbying would have been very much, certainly from the US side, definitely from the UK side, kind of very much kind of push the Zelensky peace formula, this kind of 10-point formula, which sat at kind of one move from actually what the Swiss wanted to do, which was a much more kind of broad-based approach. So yeah, there would, without doubt, have been active US and UK lobbying.
Well, that seems to me to say that our influence is both the US and the UK seems to be waning in the Middle East, that we can't get some of our allies to do what we want in a different region.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. And you see, actually, there's been recent reporting about this Saudi decision in terms of how it trades its oil. This kind of move away from an over-reliance of dollar in terms of the way it trades its oil, and that's potentially quite a seismic move, actually.
Right. I wonder if we could take a little bit of a diversion. That's a really important issue here. I've just seen minimal headlines about it in the press. How serious of a potential switch is this?
It's serious in terms of the long-term shift, away from over-reliance on dollar to trade in exports, of in Saudi's case, oil, mostly. And this is very much being driven by kind of Russia and China. They're saying, particularly on the back of the G7 decision to kind of lend Ukraine 50 billion, using the interest from the Russian stolen assets. It's 329 billion that's kind of mostly held in Belgium. That would have put the spookers up. People in Saudi Arabia and other countries are saying, well, actually, what if they steal our sovereign reserves as well? And you build up reserves by trading, and if you're trading in dollars, you build up dollar reserves, right? So actually, you're saying, well, let's trade in other currencies instead to reduce that risk long term. Now, this isn't a kind of short-term risk to the US economy per se, because the US dollar is still by far the biggest kind of global reserve currency, but it's been losing its kind of status over the past decade slowly. It's still bigger by far than any other kind of currency in the world. But over the next decade, I think you're going to see increasingly, the Saudi shift, could herald a shift, from other kind of trading nations in the global south towards kind of local currency transactions for their exports, and that could put a serious dent in the US dollar's position as a kind of global trading currency. Not now, not next year, but certainly over the next decade. And what that means, is upward pressure on US interest rates, because the less people trade in dollars, the less demand there is for dollars, the more sort of pressure that puts on interest rates, sort of pushing them up to kind of maintain the attractiveness of the US as an investment destination. That makes US debt harder to service. I mean, that's a big long-term game. It's not a right now thing, it's kind of long-term, but it's very much a kind of a thing that the Russians and the Chinese in particular are pushing, and the Saudi move is actually very, very significant and one to be watched.
Yeah, something that we need to be paying. It's basically a shot across our bow that I'm not sure we're paying attention to, because I think we still are of the opinion that we can do whatever we want and everyone's just going to fall in line eventually. But I think those days may be over. One other thing I want to look at here is, Gary, if you could put the last slide up there, the last headline there. I think there's the next one. Yeah, that one, I think. No, I apologize, Gary. It was the one you just had up there. If you could put that one back. Yeah. One of the things you said here there toward the end, you said a follow-up event in Saudi Arabia will put more pressure on Zelensky to compromise. Do you have any update on when that might be, or even if there will be a follow-up in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think the when people have been talking about later this year, sort of in the autumn time, as a possible. I mean, and I think the Americans will have something to say to that, particularly as they won't necessarily want it to be fouling sort of run up to the US presidential election. So the specific timing is up for grabs. Saudi seems to be the kind of place that the EU folks kind of favor. But let's see in terms of timing, in terms of substance. I mean, actually, I can't see there being any big step forward from this event if there's no change in focus of the summit. If that event, whenever it happens in Saudi, still excludes Russia, then I think it will be even less effective than this event in Switzerland.
Now, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was China and Brazil said that they would be for a negotiated settlement at a peace conference as long as it included Russia. And might that be something joined in with the Saudi position?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Saudis are quite clear that, they want all parties to be involved and for compromises, from both sides, to be made. So, if an event happens in Saudi and, the US and the Ukrainians still push on not including, and the EU, I'm sure, would do so as well, not including Russia, then actually, there would be kind of less benefit to having the event than the event that's just happened, which achieved very little. So that the pressure is going to grow, if not from the US, and certainly from sort of China, Brazil, BRICS countries, essentially kind of non-Western G20 countries, that actually, if you really want this other kind of moment in the spotlight where all the focus is on you, Zelensky, then actually you're going to have the Russians here as well. Otherwise, we're not going to kind of push ahead with this.
Do you think that there's any risk that you could get China, Brazil, India, and Saudi Arabia to say, hey, we want to hold a peace conference and we'll invite both Russia and Ukraine so that we can discuss something? Is there any possibility that there could be enough momentum for something like that, that even without the United States, something could happen?
Yeah, no, that absolutely could. In fact, as you know, kind of Brazil has its own, I mean, China's had its own kind of peace proposal of some time, which the Americans and the Europeans have done their best to kind of discredit. Lula da Silva now in Brazil has his own kind of peace plan. I think he's working that up partly in conjunction, with the Chinese. I think so long as this kind of big gulf continues to run through the summer, about Russia's involvement or non-involvement, I think there's definitely scope for kind of, the BRICS family to kind of go out on its own and have a more inclusive kind of global south-focused summit where they say, well, actually, we'll have Russia and Ukraine if Ukraine is willing to come. And that will be the point, I think, where the pressure will be on Zelensky, because if both sides are invited, that puts Zelensky in the invidious position of potentially having to refuse, because Putin might be there. So that will be quite a really, really fascinating dynamic in that situation, if that makes sense.
And let me ask you, what is your opinion of I don't know if you can put a number on it or percentage wise, but a number of European states might be happy with anything that's going to have a chance to get the war over with, and they'll support any kind of a plan, as long as they don't have to directly go against the United States or UK or France, Germany, etc. Is there any move for the appetite in Europe to just get the war over with, however?
Well, they're absolutely, yeah. You certainly poll ordinary citizens. Ordinary citizens would like to see an end to the war, and actually, support for the war varies hugely from country to country. Actually, but I think it's certainly sort of southern European countries tend to be more opposed to the war than kind of northern European countries. Actually, for example, so you see, places like Greece, for example, have big polling ratings against, the war, not just against the war, but against the supply of weapons, to Ukraine to fight the war. So there were huge swings in opinion between the publics of the different states, depending on where they are in Europe. And you see something like Hungary, for example, is an outlier, kind of Slovakia is an outlier. So there's definitely scope to encourage some, if not all, but then some of the European states to come. And bear in mind of the kind of 49 essentially kind of European countries that actually associated themselves with the communique. Sorry, 45, I think it was. Actually, only 27 of those are EU member states. There are a whole bunch of non-EU member European countries, like Serbia's, for example, some of the Balkan states, Montenegro, North Macedonia, that might also be kind of encouraged to actually come to a separate sort of global South-led, BRICS-led kind of piece at the summit, which would be more tempting for kind of some of the EU members to step out from their little sort of family tent and actually join them as well. So that some really interesting dynamics that could play around.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out, I suppose. Last question I want to ask you here is about how much is anybody thinking about what comes next? Like, say, when this war is concluded, by whatever means, by whatever deals end up being worked out, about thinking about what happens next. One of the things that Putin said late last week, in addition to talking about negotiated settlement or whatever, but he seemed to indicate that getting along between Russia and Europe was still on his plate. Here's what he said.
If Europe wants to remain an independent and cultural and civilizational centers of international gravity, it needs to maintain a good relationship with Russia. And most importantly, we are ready for that.
So he's saying, even with all that's happened, he still desires to have some kind of a relationship with the West and Europe in particular. But I've seen nothing but hostility, primarily, at least from the big European states and definitely from the United States. But at some point, when the war's in, it doesn't matter what anybody wants. They're going to have to figure out some way to live together, because Russia's not going anywhere. Europe's not going anywhere. Yeah. How do we get past this?
Yeah, I mean, as and when there's an ending of hostilities in the war, I think European countries will inevitably start to kind of gravitate back towards the relationship with Russia. I mean, as you know, like the Germans and the French, traditionally were had a better relationship with the Russians than us in the UK in particular. And I think that's just a natural thing that will happen. I've never got the impression that actually Russia wanted to kind of have a permanent severing of its relationships with Europe. Its relationship with the US is much more complex, as we both know. And I think Putin would be happy to kind of have a gradual kind of rebuilding of relationships there, but he only kind of does things on a basis of trust. And at the moment, there's absolutely no trust. But I think it's inevitable at some point, if the war ends, that there'll be some gradual kind of coming together. But that starts with some detailed thinking about things like sanctions, shutting off of borders, the complete kind of exclusion of Russia now. That whole architecture of sanctions is going to take a long time to unpick. But I think, once that starts to happen, the confidence will slowly start to return, and it may take 1 or 2 decades. But I do see a gradual.
What do you say about the prospect that, because of all these sanctions we've had really since 2014, and much less the hundreds or thousands, whatever the number is today, that have been hoisted on since the 2022 invasion, that because Russia had to pivot and redirect its economy east, and to find new markets for a lot of these things that were not as vulnerable to Western sanctions, that even if things get back, that Russia will not looking to be going back to the status quo ante, and to have all the connections with the West that it had, but that it will keep some diversification, which will keep it, I guess, it not just at arm's length, but it will keep it less vulnerable to Western pressure going forward. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and just normalization doesn't just mean trade normalization, of course. I mean, back in 2014, the EU was accounted for about 45% of Russia's trade, and now it's probably less than 5% of Russia's trade. I don't think kind of Russia, necessarily sees normalization as a way to kind of fully rebuild, the economic relationship with Europe that it had before. But there's so much more to it than that. There's like opening up the borders so that people can travel to Russia from Europe and Russian people can travel to Europe, from Russia. There's exclusion from cultural and sporting activity. There's academic exchanges between universities that have been completely cut off. There are so many things that aren't even related to trade that could be started to sort of eased to begin the process of normalization. I think Russia is happy to have pivoted. I mean, yeah, sure, we'd like to sell some of its oil and gas to Europe again. I'm sure it would, but I don't think that's the top of its priority list. Ironically, I think getting back in the Eurovision Song Contest and actually having a much more open and normal kind of border relationship with Europe would probably be higher on its list in the short term, at least.
And you think that this is like if not a generational, probably a decades long process?
Yeah, no, I do, and because again, nobody talks about it. I mean, when Putin said that the dropping of Western sanctions, he wasn't just meaning economic sanctions. I mean, it's going to be the subject of my next article, probably. People in the West need to start doing some detailed thinking about, well, how are you going to phase this? I mean, the sanctions are so enormous against Russia.
Yeah.
That actually, there needs to be some detailed thinking about how you sequence these things in and to what extent you use kind of lessening off of sanctions as part of a carrot to incentivize kind of a Russian adherence to any future peace proposal that's agreed between Russia and Ukraine. There needs to be some really detailed, which you never see in the Western press, about, well, how are we going to have
there's a lot of things we don't see in the Western press. Well, listen, I will look very much forward to reading that, so please do send that to me as soon as it gets published. And just wanted to remind people again that this is your recently published book after you left the diplomatic service, A Misfit in Moscow. It's available on Amazon and probably anywhere else that people look for books. Thank you again for coming on today, Ian. Always a pleasure, and look forward to having you back on in the very near future.
Thanks, Danny. All the best. Love to see you again. Best wishes to Francis.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. We've got another show coming up here in just about 15 minutes, I guess. I think we're going to go. We got Jason back. We hadn't had him on for a while, so really eager to have him back on there talking about Trump threatens to cut Ukraine aid if he wins. And what does that mean for the course of the war, and especially between now and the next election in November? Tune in to see that, and we'll look forward to seeing you very shortly on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.